The year is 1732. A small village in Serbia. A man dies. Normal, right? But 40 days later, villagers dig up his grave, pull out his corpse, and drive a wooden stake through his heart. Then they burn the body. Why? Because his neighbors are calling him a vampire. And here's where things get weird. The people doing this aren't ignorant peasants. This is being done under the supervision of official Austrian Imperial army doctors. Reports are being written, sent to Vienna, and then all of Europe loses its mind. Welcome to the 18th century's strangest, most terrifying mass hysteria event. An event so wild that it made the European Enlightenment pause and ask, wait, are vampires actually real? This is the story of how dead bodies caused international incidents, how the Austrian Empire created vampire investigation protocols, and how an entire continent became convinced that the dead were crawling out of their graves to feast on the living. Spoiler alert, they weren't. But try telling that to 18th century Europe. Let's dive into the madness. The Peter Plogojevich case, patient zero of the panic. Picture this. It's 1725, a village called Kisilova in Serbia. Just a regular Tuesday in the Balkans. And then Peter Plogojevich dies. Peter was just a guy, a peasant. Probably complained about taxes, maybe had strong opinions about crop rotation. You know, normal dead guy stuff. He gets buried, everyone's sad, life goes on. Except life doesn't go on, because within 8 days, 9 people in the village die. And before they die, they all say the same thing. Peter Plogojevich came to me in the night and choked me. Now, you might think, okay, clearly they're sick with something, maybe hallucinating. But this is 1725. Germ theory won't be a thing for another 150 years. To these villagers, there's only one logical explanation. Peter is a vampire. So what do? They march to the local priest, then to the Austrian Imperial administrator, and demand to dig up Peter's body. The administrator is like, guys, this is insane. But the villagers are ready to riot. They're carrying torches and stakes. This is mob mentality at its finest, and honestly, very on brand for human history. The administrator finally agrees, probably thinking, fine, we'll dig them up, show them it's just a corpse. Everyone calms down. Except when they open the grave, things get weird. According to the official report sent to Vienna, Peter's body hasn't decomposed. His hair and nails appear to have grown. There's fresh blood around his mouth. Old skin has fallen off to reveal new skin. And the real kicker, no smell of decay. The administrator writes all this down, sends it to Vienna, and then watches as the villagers stake Peter through the heart, burn his body, and scatter the ashes. Problem solved, right? Wrong, because this report reaches Vienna just as another case explodes, and this one is even worse. Arnold Powell, the case that broke Europe. Another Serbian village, Medveja. A guy named Arnold Powell falls off a hay wagon and dies. Tragic, but accidents happen. But here's where Arnold's story gets interesting. Before he died, Arnold had told people that years ago, while serving in the army in Turkey, he'd been attacked by a vampire. He claimed he'd cured himself by eating dirt from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with the vampire's blood. I know what you're thinking. My man Arnold was definitely dealing with some stuff. But to his neighbors, this backstory suddenly makes everything make sense when after his death, people start dying. 4 people die within weeks, all claiming Arnold visited them at night. So the villagers do what's becoming standard procedure. Dig him up, they find the same signs, no decomposition, fresh blood, the works. They stake him, burn him, case closed. Except it's not closed, because 5 years later, in 1731, people start dying again. 17 people die in 3 months, and the villagers are convinced Arnold didn't just become a vampire, he infected the livestock, and now people who ate meat from those animals are becoming vampires too. This is vampire infection theory, and it's spreading faster than the supposed vampires themselves. The Austrian Empire are now paying attention. This isn't just peasant superstition anymore. People are dying. Villages are in chaos. The economy is being affected because people are too scared to farm. So the Austrian Empire does what any rational 18th century government would do. They send in military doctors to investigate. The Flückinger Report, when medicine met mythology. Enter Johann Flückinger, an Austrian military surgeon. This guy is educated, trained in medicine, a man of science. His job is to investigate these vampire claims and restore order. He arrives in Medveja in December 1731. He's expecting to debunk everything, write a report about mass hysteria, and go home. Instead, he ends up writing one of the most bizarre medical documents in history. He personally supervises the exhumation of multiple bodies, and in his official report, he describes things that don't make medical sense. Bodies buried for months showing no signs of decomposition, liquid blood in corpses, bodies that appear plump and well-fed despite being dead for weeks, organs that seem fresh when cut open. Flückinger documents all of this. He's not some village priest making stuff up. He's a trained surgeon, and he's genuinely confused. In his report, he uses the word vampire officially, possibly the first time it appears in a Western medical document. The Flückinger report gets published. It gets translated. It spreads across Europe. And suddenly, everyone's talking about vampires. Universities start debating it. Theologians write treatises. Philosophers argue about it. The word vampire enters multiple European languages almost overnight. Before this, they were called different things in different regions. Upir in Slavic regions, vrikolakas in Greece. But now, everyone's saying vampire. And here's the thing that really baked everyone's noodle. These weren't reports from some distant, exotic land. This was happening in the Austrian Empire, in Christian villages, to regular people. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. The panic was officially on. Why the Balkans? Geography of fear. You might be wondering, why Serbia? Why this region? Great question, because geography actually matters here. The Balkans in the 18th century were a mess. This is the frontier between the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Wars have been fought here for centuries. Borders keep changing. Different religions and cultures are smashing into each other. It's basically the Europe's anxiety made into a place. These regions had just been through the Great Turkish War, which ended in 1999. Then there was the Austro-Turkish War in 1716 to 1718. Plague outbreaks, famines, general chaos. People were traumatized, constantly displaced, living with death as a daily reality. And here's something interesting. The Austrian Empire had just taken control of these territories from the Ottomans, so you have Austrian officials, often German-speaking and Catholic, trying to govern Slavic Orthodox Christian populations who have their own folk traditions about the undead. These folk traditions were old, really old. Slavic folklore had always included beliefs about the dead returning, but under Ottoman rule, these beliefs had stayed local and contained. Now, with Austrian bureaucracy documenting everything and sending reports to Vienna, local folklore was colliding with Enlightenment-era record-keeping. It's like that moment when your weird family tradition that makes total sense to you suddenly gets explained to outsiders and everyone's like, wait, you do what at Christmas? The Austrian officials were experiencing cultural whiplash. They're children of the Enlightenment. They believe in reason and science, but they're also seeing things they can't explain with their current medical knowledge. And the local populations were like, yeah, this is vampire stuff. We've been dealing with this for centuries. Why are you surprised? The symptoms. What people actually saw. Let's talk about what people were actually experiencing, because it's important to understand this wasn't just mass delusion. Real things were happening. They just weren't vampires. People were dying in clusters. Entire families would get sick and die within weeks. Within small villages where everyone knows everyone, this pattern was terrifying and obvious. The dying would report similar symptoms: weakness, difficulty breathing, chest pain, seeing deceased relatives at night. Some would have nightmares of a weight pressing on their chest, being unable to move or scream. Any of this sounding familiar? Because if you've ever experienced sleep paralysis, you're probably getting chills right now. Sleep paralysis, where you're conscious but can't move and often hallucinate a presence in the room, was not understood in the 18th century. To someone experiencing it, especially if they were already sick and feverish, it absolutely felt like something supernatural was attacking them. Add to this the fact that tuberculosis was rampant. TB causes you to waste away, cough up blood, become pale, and often runs through families because it's contagious. Someone with TB genuinely looks like they're being drained of life, and before they die, they often have fever-induced hallucinations. So you have sick people hallucinating, healthy people experiencing sleep paralysis, and everyone dying of diseases they don't understand. The vampire explanation actually makes sense to them because it explains all the patterns they're seeing. But the real horror show started when they dug up the bodies. The corpses. Understanding decomposition gone wrong. Here's where we need to talk about something gross but essential. What actually happens to bodies after death? The reports from these exhumations consistently describe the same things. No decomposition, fresh blood, groaning sounds when stakes were driven in, bodies appearing plump and well-fed. To 18th century observers, this was evidence of vampirism. To us, with modern forensic knowledge, this is just decomposition, but decomposition that doesn't look like what they expected. First, the no decomposition thing. Bodies decompose at different rates depending on soil type, temperature, moisture, and how the person died. Clay-heavy soil, which was common in the Balkans, can slow decomposition significantly. Cold weather, same thing. A body that hasn't decomposed much after a few weeks isn't supernatural, it's just chemistry. Second, the fresh blood. When you die, your blood pools at the lowest points due to gravity. If a body's lying on its back, blood accumulates in the back and can seep out through the mouth and nose when the body's moved or disturbed. This blood can remain liquid for quite a while, especially in cold conditions. Third, the groaning. When you drive a stake through a corpse, you're forcing air out of the lungs through the throat. That makes sound. It's not the dead coming back to life, it's just trapped gases being expelled. But imagine you're in 1730, it's a misty morning, you just drove a stake into your dead neighbor's chest and you hear a groan. You're not thinking, ah yes, pneumatic pressure. You're thinking, oh my god, it's alive. Fourth, the plump, well-fed appearance. Bodies can bloat during decomposition as bacteria produce gases. This can make a corpse look fatter and fresher than when the person was alive. Skin can slip off, revealing what looks like new skin underneath. Hair and nails appear to grow because the skin around them recedes. Every single sign of vampirism had a natural explanation, but nobody knew these explanations in 1730. Forensic pathology wasn't a thing yet. Most doctors had never systematically studied decomposition, so when educated military surgeons saw these bodies, they were as confused as the peasants. This is what made the panic so powerful. It wasn't just superstitious villagers freaking out. It was doctors writing official reports saying, I don't know what this is, but something weird is happening. The spread. How panic became epidemic. Once those reports reached Vienna and got published, it was game over for rational discourse. The vampire panic spread through Europe like wildfire, or more likely a Twitter trend, but with actual corpses. German universities started holding debates about vampires. Seriously, scholars at Leipzig and other prestigious institutions were writing dissertations with titles like On the Chewing and Gnawing of the Dead in Their Graves. Yeah, that was a real concern. People believe vampires started their undead careers by chewing on their shrouds and their own flesh before graduating to attacking the living. There are reports of people putting rocks in corpses' mouths to prevent shroud chewing. It's like a medieval version of parental controls. The Catholic Church got involved. The Protestant Church got involved. Everyone had opinions. Some clergy said vampires were real and evidence of Satan's power. Others said vampirism was superstition and the real sin was defiling corpses. French philosophers like Voltaire weighed in, using the vampire debate as ammunition against superstition and organized religion. Voltaire basically said, "You people believe in vampires but think I'm crazy for questioning the church? Okay then." Newspapers published vampire stories, books were written, poems were composed. The word vampire became part of everyday conversation. People started seeing vampires everywhere. Every unexplained death became potential evidence. Every grave became suspect. And here's the feedback loop that made it worse. The more people talked about vampires, the more people started experiencing symptoms. If you're told every night that vampires attack people in their sleep, and you have a nightmare or sleep paralysis, you're going to think a vampire attacked you. Then you tell your neighbors, who become more anxious, who are more likely to have sleep disturbances, and the cycle continues. It's like when you read about symptoms online and suddenly you're convinced you have that exact disease. Except in 1730s Europe, everyone was WebMDing themselves into vampire attacks. Villages started preventively digging up bodies of anyone who seemed suspicious. Had a bad reputation in life? Vampire. Died suddenly? Vampire. Looked weird? Definitely a vampire. The Austrian Empire had to step in because things were getting out of control. People were destroying cemeteries, burning bodies without proper authorization, and generally causing chaos. The government started requiring official permission for exhumations, which just made people more convinced there was a cover-up. Why won't they let us dig up and burn grandma? What are they hiding? The science scramble, Enlightenment versus the undead. The timing of this panic is crucial to understand. This is happening during the Enlightenment, when European intellectuals are supposed to be embracing reason, science, and rational thought. And here they are, seriously debating if the dead are rising from their graves. It created this fascinating tension. On one hand, you have Enlightenment thinkers who want to believe in empirical evidence and natural laws. On the other hand, you have empirical evidence being collected by trained observers that seems to suggest something supernatural is happening. Scientists and doctors who investigated the phenomenon were stuck. They couldn't explain the lack of decomposition with their current knowledge. They couldn't explain the liquid blood. They were trained to trust observation and the evidence was weird. Some tried to find middle ground. Maybe vampires were real, but they were natural, not supernatural. Maybe it was some kind of disease that mimicked death. Maybe there was a medical explanation for why some corpses didn't decay. A German physician named Michael Ramth wrote a book trying to explain vampires naturally. He suggested premature burial might explain some cases. People buried alive would desperately try to eat their shrouds, explaining the chewing reports. When they finally died, their struggles would leave the corpse looking disturbed and bloody. This explanation was actually pretty close to the truth for some cases. Medical knowledge in the 18th century was primitive enough that determining death wasn't always accurate. Comas, catalepsy, and other conditions could make someone appear dead when they weren't. There are documented cases of people waking up in coffins. Absolutely horrifying and absolutely real. But the premature burial theory couldn't explain all the vampire reports, so it didn't stop the panic. The Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, a genuinely pragmatic ruler, got fed up with the whole thing. In 1755, she had her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, investigate the vampire claims. Van Swieten was a no-nonsense Dutch doctor who had zero patience for supernatural explanations. He examined the evidence, explained decomposition, and wrote a report basically saying, "This is all natural processes you people don't understand. Stop digging up corpses." He called the vampire hunters ignorant and barbaric. Maria Theresa used this report to ban vampire hunting and unsanctioned exhumations in 1755. The law made it illegal to disturb graves without official permission, with serious penalties for violations. Problem solved? Not really, because laws can't stop panic, and the vampire belief had already spread beyond Austria's borders.
So you're an 18th century villager convinced that your deceased neighbor is now a vampire? What do? Well, Europe had developed an entire arsenal of anti-vampire techniques, and they were wild. The wooden stake through the heart is the most famous method, but here's what people didn't realize. It's actually not a Slavic tradition originally. The stake was borrowed from the practice of staking down criminals and suicides who were considered at risk of becoming vengeful spirits. Over time, the methods merged. But staking wasn't enough for serious vampire problems. Oh no, you had to be thorough. After staking, you'd decapitate the body. Some traditions said you had to place the head between the legs or bury it separately. Why? Because apparently vampires are like chickens and can run around without their heads if you're not careful. The logic of folklore is spectacular. Then you'd burn the body and scatter the ashes, ideally in running water, because vampires can apparently regenerate from their ashes if you just leave them lying around. These undead really had an impressive healing factor, like some kind of supernatural Wolverine. Some regions had unique additions. In Silesia, they'd place poppy seeds in the coffin because vampires supposedly had OCD and would be compelled to count every seed, keeping them busy until sunrise. Yes, vampires with counting compulsions. It's like Sesame Street's Count Vam Count was actually a documentary. Garlic was used, but not in the way movies show it. You'd stuff garlic in the mouth, nose, ears, and other orifices of the corpse. The idea was to prevent the vampire spirit from re-entering the body. It also had the practical benefit of masking the smell of decomposition, which was probably the real reason it became popular. Holy water, crucifixes, and religious items were part of the arsenal, but interestingly, they were less common in the actual Balkan practices. Those were more of a Western edition, showing how vampire lore was being filtered through Catholic and Protestant frameworks. Some villages got creative. There are reports of thorns placed in burial shrouds, iron nails driven into the skull, heavy stones placed on the body, or bodies buried face down so if they tried to dig out, they'd dig deeper instead. My personal favorite, in some areas, they'd bury suspected vampires at crossroads, because the theory was that vampires are bad at navigation and would get confused about which way to go. Imagine being an all-powerful undead creature defeated by a four-way intersection. GPS would have ruined vampire hunting. The money behind the madness, vampire economics. Here's something nobody talks about. The vampire panic had serious economic implications, and where there's panic, there's profit. First, the grave diggers and vampire hunters. In some areas, this became an actual profession. You could hire specialist vampire hunters who would investigate, exhume, and dispose of suspected vampires. They'd charge fees for their services, creating a small industry around the supernatural. These weren't just random people with stakes. Some presented themselves as experts with special knowledge passed down through generations. They'd have rituals, procedures, special tools. They were the artisanal craftsmen of corpse destruction. Think about it from a business perspective. Fear is an excellent motivator for spending. If your village is terrified and someone shows up saying, "I'm a professional vampire hunter. I've done this in 20 villages," you're going to pay whatever they ask. It's like calling a plumber at 2 a.m., except the toilet is your dead uncle. The church was making money too. Families would pay for masses to be said for the dead, for exorcisms, for blessings of graves. Some clergy were absolutely cashing in on the fear, while others were legitimately trying to help terrified parishioners. Publishers were having a fail day. Vampire books, pamphlets, and broadsheets sold like crazy. The Flückinger report went through multiple editions and translations. People couldn't get enough vampire content. It was the 18th century equivalent of true crime podcasts. But there were economic costs too. Agricultural productivity dropped in areas affected because people were too afraid to work after dark or even leave their homes at night. Trade was disrupted because merchants didn't want to travel through vampire territory. Some villages became abandoned. If vampire attacks were reported, people would flee, leaving behind homes and fields. This created a refugee problem for neighboring areas and cost the Austrian Empire tax revenue. The costs of the exhumations themselves added up. Official investigations required paying administrators, doctors, soldiers, and gravediggers. The Austrian government was spending significant resources on vampire investigations when they could have been doing literally anything else. Insurance, yes, insurance existed then, became complicated. Some insurers tried to create exclusions for supernatural causes of death, which is hilarious. Imagine your insurance claim getting denied because vampirism is not covered under your policy. The medical mysteries, diseases that became demons. Let's talk about what was actually killing these people, because understanding the real causes makes the vampire explanation even more tragic. Tuberculosis was the big one. TB, called consumption at the time, was devastating and mysterious. It genuinely looked like victims were being slowly drained of life. They'd become pale, thin, and weak. They'd cough up blood, literally looking like something was feeding on them internally. And here's the kicker. TB spreads within families in close contacts. So when one person died of consumption, their relatives would also die too, creating exactly the pattern you'd expect from a vampire feeding on their family. The final stage of TB could include fever and delirium, causing hallucinations. Dying patients would sometimes claim to see deceased relatives calling to them. To observers, this looked like the dead returning to claim the living. Bubonic plague outbreaks were still occurring in Eastern Europe. Plague spreads fast, kills in clusters, and causes symptoms like swollen lymph nodes and blackened skin. Bodies would decompose quickly and smell terrible. But some plague victims buried during cold weather wouldn't decompose as fast, creating more confused reports. Rabies could create vampire-like symptoms in the living: aggression, fear of water, which prevented drinking and increased thirst, hypersensitivity to light and garlic, changes in behavior. Someone with rabies might bite others, spreading the disease. If that person then died and others they'd bitten got sick, it would look like the dead person was attacking people. Porphyria, a rare blood disorder, has been suggested as a possible explanation for some vampire myths. It causes sensitivity to sunlight, receding gums that make teeth look prominent, and in severe cases, a craving for blood iron. Some historians dispute this connection, but it shows how medical conditions could fuel supernatural beliefs. Ergot poisoning from contaminated grain could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrenous symptoms. An entire village eating bread from ergot-infected grain could experience collective hallucinations, including visions of the dead. Catalepsy and other conditions that mimic death could lead to premature burial. Imagine being buried alive, waking up in your coffin, desperately trying to escape, bloodying your mouth and hands on the wood, and eventually dying of suffocation. When the grave is later opened, you'd find the corpse in a disturbed position, with blood around the mouth and hands, shroud torn. Absolutely looks like something supernatural happened. Decomposition gases could build up in buried bodies, and occasionally cause corpses to move when disturbed, sitting up or shifting position. In one reported case, a bloated corpse actually burst, spraying witnesses with decomposition fluids. Imagine explaining that with 18th century science. You can't, so vampire. The Church's dilemma: theology versus terror. The Christian Church was in a complicated position during the vampire panic. On one hand, church doctrine didn't really have room for vampires. On the other hand, millions of terrified Christians were demanding answers and protection. Catholic theologians tried to fit vampires into existing frameworks. If vampires were real, were they demonic possessions of corpses? Were they souls in purgatory? Were they divine punishment for sin? None of these explanations quite worked. The problem was that vampires, as described, didn't make theological sense. If the soul left the body at death and went to heaven, hell, or purgatory, what exactly was animating the corpse? A demon? Then why did holy water and Christian rituals work against them? God wouldn't give demons that much power.
Some clergy argued that the whole thing was the devil's deception, making natural decomposition look supernatural to mock Christian faith and drive people to sin through fear. Others took the stance that vampirism was God's punishment for serious sins. If you were excommunicated, committed suicide, or lived an evil life, maybe God allowed your body to become a vessel for evil. This explanation was more popular because it fit existing beliefs about divine punishment. Protestant theologians had different takes. Some saw the vampire panic as proof that Catholics were superstitious and needed to embrace Protestant rationality. Others used it to argue that Protestantism offered better spiritual protection because it emphasized personal faith over rituals. The Orthodox Church in the Balkans had longer experience with vampire folklore and generally took a more practical approach. Orthodox priests often participated in the vampire hunting rituals, blessing the stakes and praying over the exhumations. This wasn't seen as contradicting faith, but as spiritual warfare against evil. But here's where it got messy. The church's own practices might have contributed to the panic. Christian burial rites emphasized that the body was sacred and would be resurrected on Judgment Day. So when a body didn't decay properly, it challenged fundamental theological assumptions. Incorruptible bodies of saints were venerated as miracles, but if regular people's bodies didn't decay, was that also holy? Or was it demonic? The church had to navigate explaining why Saint Agnes's uncorrupted corpse was a miracle, but your uncle's uncorrupted corpse was vampirism. Some priests made the situation worse by feeding the fear. They'd sell protective amulets, perform expensive exorcisms, or even lead vampire hunts themselves. Others tried to calm their parishes and were accused of being vampire sympathizers or being under demonic influence. The Vatican eventually had to weigh in. Pope Benedict XIV commissioned investigations and ultimately leaned toward the natural explanation camp, though he stopped short of outright denying supernatural possibility. It was a political move. Too strong a denial would anger believers, but endorsing vampire hunting was obviously problematic. Famous cases beyond the Balkans. While Serbia was zero ground, vampire cases spread across Europe, each region adding its own cultural flavor to the phenomenon. In East Prussia, the case of Janus Cuntius became famous. A town alderman died in 1624 after being kicked by a horse. After his burial, people reported seeing his ghost, hearing strange noises, and experiencing attacks at night. When they dug him up, his body was reportedly uncorrupted and flexible. The town's Protestant clergy got involved, arguing about whether this was demonic possession or natural causes. They eventually dug him up a second time, cut off his head, tore out his heart, and burned everything. The attacks stopped, which everyone took as proof that the procedure worked. In Silesia, a series of cases in the 1670s and 1680s involved people who'd committed suicide. Suicide was considered a grave sin, so the bodies were buried without proper rites. When problems occurred in the villages afterward, the suicide victims were blamed and exhumed. This created a feedback loop where suicide victims were automatically suspects in any subsequent misfortune. Moravia had its own vampire epidemic in the 1750s. A woman named Rosina Palakin died and was buried, but villagers soon reported that she was appearing at night, attacking people and animals. When exhumed, her body was allegedly fresh and alive. They burned her, but the panic spread to neighboring villages, with more exhumations and burnings. In Hungary, the case of a herdsman named Peter attracted attention in 1732, right as the Serbian cases were making news. Peter allegedly returned from the dead to assault people. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing him. When the body was exhumed, it was staked, but the attacks continued, so they burned it. The case became entangled with local power struggles between different noble families. Russia had its own vampire folklore, though they used different terms like upir. Russian Orthodox Church records contain multiple accounts of corpse desecration due to vampire fears. Tsar Peter the Great actually issued decrees against vampire hunting, but enforcement in distant provinces was minimal. Even in Western Europe, there were cases. In France, reports of revenants, or returners, date back centuries, though the 17th century panic brought renewed attention. French intellectuals debated whether these were the same as the Eastern European vampires or different phenomena. England had less vampire activity, but was fascinated by the continental cases. English newspapers published translations of vampire reports, and British philosophers weighed in on the debates. The vampire panic influenced Gothic literature that would emerge later in British culture.
What's interesting is how each culture interpreted the vampire phenomenon through its own religious and social lens. Catholic regions emphasized exorcism and holy protection. Protestant areas focused on moral failings and sin. Orthodox regions had older folk traditions to draw on, but everyone agreed the dead were doing something weird. The breaking point, when science finally pushed back. By the 1750s and 1760s, the vampire panic was starting to break, not because people stopped being afraid, but because authorities and intellectuals had had enough. Gerard van Sweeten's 1755 report for Empress Maria Theresa was a turning point. Van Sweeten didn't just dismiss the vampire claims, he methodically explained every supernatural phenomenon with natural causes. Fresh blood, putrefaction gases forcing blood out, no decay, soil conditions and temperature, groaning sounds, trapped air being expelled. He also pointed out the obvious: if vampires were real and had been active for centuries, the entire population should be dead now. The mathematics of vampire reproduction don't work. One vampire allegedly creates multiple new vampires, which each create more. It's exponential. Where were all these vampires? French Enlightenment figures piled on. Voltaire used vampires as a weapon against superstition in general. He wrote mockingly about how Europe was more concerned with dead bodies than living injustices. Diderot's encyclopedia included articles debunking vampire claims.
Medical education was improving. More doctors were learning about decomposition, disease transmission, and forensic investigation. As these educated physicians spread through Europe, they could explain to local populations what was actually happening. The development of better diagnostic techniques meant fewer people were buried alive. Being able to more accurately confirm death removed one of the genuine causes of vampire reports. Governments started cracking down hard on unauthorized exhumations. The penalties became severe: fines, imprisonment, even corporal punishment for vampire hunting without official permission. The Austrian Empire in particular treated grave disturbance as a serious crime. Church authorities were pressured to discourage vampire beliefs. Bishops issued pastoral letters explaining that vampires were superstition and that Christians should trust in God's protection rather than desecrating graves. Some clergy who had encouraged vampire hunting were disciplined. Public education campaigns began. Governments published pamphlets explaining decomposition and disease. It was essentially a public health initiative disguised as supernatural debunking. But the biggest factor in ending the panic was probably just time. Generations that had experienced the height of the panic died off. New generations grew up with different fears and concerns. The vampire panic faded the way most moral panics do, gradually, as people found new things to worry about.
The legal aftermath. Laws written in fear. The vampire panic left actual laws in its wake, which is wild when you think about it. European governments wrote official legislation about undead creatures. The Austrian Empire's 1755 law wasn't just about vampires specifically, it was about regulating death, burial, and the handling of corpses. It established protocols for confirming death, required waiting periods before burial, and restricted who could authorize exhumations. These laws inadvertently improved public health. The waiting periods before burial meant fewer people were buried alive. The regulations on corpse handling helped prevent disease spread. The requirement for medical examination of suspicious deaths led to better death investigation procedures. But some laws got oddly specific. There are records of local ordinances about how to bury suicide victims, deep with heavy stones, how to handle executed criminals, special cemeteries away from the general population, and procedures for dealing with suspicious corpses. Some regions maintained vampire prevention laws well into the 19th century, long after educated people stopped believing in vampires. These laws were kept on the books out of tradition or because rural populations still wanted the protection. There are reports of the last legal vampire exhumation happening in Romania in the 1880s. Local authorities followed old protocols, even though they probably didn't believe in vampires anymore. It was more about respecting community traditions and preventing people from taking matters into their own hands. The laws also affected inheritance and property rights. If someone was declared a vampire, it could affect how their property was distributed. Some families fought these declarations in court, not because they didn't believe in vampires, but because the vampire label carried legal and financial consequences. Medical progress. Death gets scientific. The vampire panic ironically advanced medical science. The need to explain vampire reports led to systematic study of decomposition, disease transmission, and death itself. Doctors started doing autopsies more regularly. Understanding what happens to bodies after death became a legitimate field of study instead of just something grave robbers knew about. The investigation of vampire cases led to better documentation of infectious disease patterns. When doctors tracked who was dying and in what order, they started to notice patterns that suggested contagion rather than supernatural causes. Forensic medicine emerged partially from this era. The need to definitively determine cause of death, time of death, and post-mortem changes became important. Vampire investigations required documentation, which created standards for death investigation that are still used today. The push to prevent premature burial led to developments in confirming death. Doctors experimented with tests, observing putrefaction, testing for breathing, checking for heartbeat with better instruments. Some of these methods were terrible, like cutting the corpse's feet to see if it bled, but the overall trend toward rigorous death confirmation was positive. Study of sleep disorders advanced too. As doctors tried to explain nightmare reports and sleep paralysis experiences that fueled vampire beliefs, they began documenting these phenomena scientifically. The vampire panic also highlighted the need for better public health infrastructure. Governments realized that mysterious cluster deaths were causing massive social disruption. This led to investment in doctors, hospitals, and disease monitoring, infrastructure that would help combat real epidemics. The cultural evolution, how vampires became sexy. Here's where things get really interesting. The terrifying village demons of the 18th century gradually transformed into the romantic figures we know today. This transformation is honestly one of the wildest evolutions in cultural history. In the early 1800s, Romantic-era writers started using vampires as metaphors. The vampire became a symbol of forbidden desire, aristocratic decadence, and sexual transgression. This was a complete 180 from the bloated peasant corpses of the Balkan villages. Lord Byron's physician, John Polidori, wrote The Vampire in 1819, creating Lord Ruthven, a sophisticated aristocrat vampire. This was the first time vampires got the gentlemanly makeover. Ruthven was charming, seductive, and preyed on high society, nothing like the Serbian farmers who started the whole thing. This shift reflected Romantic literature's obsessions: death, sexuality, aristocracy, and the exotic Orient, which included Eastern Europe in the British imagination. Vampires became a way to write about taboo subjects. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872 added lesbian undertones, making vampires even more tied to forbidden sexuality. The vampire's bite became metaphorical seduction. Then came Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, which cemented the modern vampire archetype. Stoker combined Eastern European folklore with Victorian anxieties about sexuality, immigration, disease, and changing gender roles. Count Dracula was sophisticated, foreign, sexually threatening, and literally invaded England. What's hilarious is that Stoker never visited Eastern Europe. His research came from books and secondhand accounts. He created a fantastical version of Transylvania that bore little resemblance to reality. Modern tourists visit Romania expecting Dracula's castle and find a regular castle that was sort of associated with Vlad the Impaler, who wasn't even a vampire. The 20th century continued the evolution. Movies made vampires visual and glamorous. Bela Lugosi's Dracula in 1931 established the look: evening wear, cape, dramatic accent. Vampires became movie monsters, then anti-heroes, then romantic leads.
By the time we get to the Interview with a Vampire in 1976 and the Anne Rice novels, vampires are tragic, philosophical figures, struggling with immortality and morality. They're basically immortal goths having existential crises. The Twilight series made vampires sparkle and turned them into teenage heartthrobs. This would have absolutely baffled 18th century Serbian peasants. You mean the bloated corpse that killed my livestock is now a vegetarian who plays baseball and goes to high school? What? Modern vampire fiction often completely ignores the folklore origins. Vampires can go out in daylight with sparkles or sunscreen, don't need to be invited into homes, aren't afraid of garlic or crosses, and often don't even kill their victims. The transformation from horrifying plague on the village to potential boyfriend is complete. It's like if we took the Black Death and in 300 years turned it into a sexy romantic lead. Actually, don't give Hollywood ideas. The conspiracy theories. Vampires in the modern age. You'd think the vampire panic would just be a historical curiosity, but oh no, the internet has given it new life, pun intended. There are people today who genuinely believe vampires are real and that the 18th century cases were covered up. They point to the laws banning vampire hunting as evidence of government conspiracy to hide the truth. Why would they ban it if vampires weren't real, is apparently compelling logic. Some conspiracy theories claim that vampire hunting was suppressed because vampires infiltrated governments and protected themselves. There are theories that various historical figures were vampires, everyone from Vlad the Impaler, obvious choice, to Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, to weirdly specific claims about random nobles. Modern vampirism exists as both a medical condition, people who genuinely believe they need to consume blood, and a subculture, people who drink blood consensually as part of alternative lifestyles. Neither has anything to do with the undead, but they get conflated with historical vampire beliefs. There are vampire hunting communities online, not metaphorical, people who claim to be tracking and fighting actual vampires. They share evidence, discuss tactics, and warn about vampire activity. It's like if ghost hunting shows got mixed with LARPing and nobody acknowledged it was pretend. The city of New Orleans has leaned into vampire tourism hard. There are vampire tours, vampire shops, people claiming to be vampires. Some of this is just good marketing, but there's a real subculture of people who identify as vampires and take it seriously. Romania, particularly Transylvania, has built an entire tourism industry on Dracula, despite the fact that Bram Stoker's vampire has almost nothing to do with Romanian folklore. They've created a version of their own history based on a British novel. That's some advanced cultural appropriation in reverse. There are academic debates about whether the vampire panic was actually about vampires or was code for something else: repressed sexuality, fear of disease, social anxiety about death. Literary scholars and historians argue about what vampires really represent. Some modern pagans and occultists have incorporated vampire folklore into their practices, creating new rituals and beliefs based on 18th century accounts. Whether this is cultural preservation or just making stuff up depends on who you ask. The science of why we believed. Psychology of mass hysteria.
Looking back at the vampire panic with modern psychology, we can understand why it happened and spread so effectively. Humans are pattern-seeking animals. We're really good at seeing connections even when they don't exist. When multiple people die in a village, our brains want an explanation that connects them. Random disease is scary because it means anyone could be next. Vampire is also scary, but at least there's a clear cause and a way to fight it. Confirmation bias played a huge role. Once you believe vampires are real, everything confirms it. Person dies after claiming to see a deceased relative? Vampire. Animal found dead with wounds? Vampire. You have a nightmare? Definitely a vampire. Contradictory evidence gets ignored or explained away. Social proof matters. If everyone in your village believes in vampires, you believe in vampires. Disagreeing with the group is psychologically difficult and socially dangerous. Mob mentality takes over, and suddenly reasonable people are doing unreasonable things. The availability heuristic makes recent dramatic events seem more common than they are.
If you just heard about vampire attacks in a neighboring village, you overestimate the risk of it happening to you. Media reporting, pamphlets, sermons, and gossip made vampire stories more available to people's thinking. Fear is contagious, literally. Anxiety spreads through communities. If your neighbor is terrified of vampires, you become more vigilant, more likely to interpret ambiguous events as threatening, and more likely to experience anxiety-related symptoms like sleep disturbances. The illusion of control is powerful. Vampire hunting gave people a sense of doing something about their fear and helplessness in the face of disease and death. Even if it didn't work, the ritual of digging up and destroying the vampire provided psychological relief. Group polarization means that when people with similar beliefs discuss something, they end up with more extreme versions of those beliefs. Village meetings about vampire problems didn't lead to rational discussion. They led to everyone becoming more convinced and more extreme in their responses. Sleep deprivation and stress make people more susceptible to hallucinations and misperceptions. Communities dealing with disease outbreaks were stressed, afraid, and probably not sleeping well. This made them more likely to experience and believe in supernatural encounters. The backfire effect means that attempts to debunk vampire beliefs sometimes made people believe even stronger. When authorities said vampires aren't real, some people interpreted this as a cover-up, which confirmed their suspicions. Post hoc rationalization let people explain away failed vampire hunts. We destroyed the vampire, but attacks continued. Became, there must be more vampires, rather than maybe this wasn't caused by vampires. Unfalsifiable beliefs are extremely persistent. Modern parallels. We're not so different. Before we get too smug about how irrational 18th century people were, let's talk about modern mass panics that work on the same psychological principles. The satanic panic of the 1980s to 90s convinced thousands of Americans that secret satanic cults were ritually abusing children. Therapists using questionable techniques recovered memories of abuse that never happened. People went to prison. Careers were ruined, all based on beliefs as unfounded as vampires. The 2016 Pizzagate conspiracy theorized that a pizza restaurant was running a child trafficking ring based on coded emails. Someone showed up with a gun to investigate. The code-breaking logic was as rigorous as assuming that anyone who doesn't decompose is a vampire. Anti-vaccination movements reject scientific evidence in favor of patterns they perceive in their communities. Multiple kids got sick after vaccination becomes vaccines are poisoning our children, ignoring base rates and confounding factors. It's the same pattern seeking that led to vampire accusations. QAnon convinced millions that a secret cabal of cannibalistic pedophiles runs the world, and that cryptic internet posts contain hidden truths. The psychology is identical to vampire panic. Pattern finding, confirmation bias, social proof, us versus them thinking. The Havana syndrome, where US diplomats reported mysterious symptoms, may have been mass psychogenic illness, the modern equivalent of vampire attacks. Real symptoms, real fear, but possibly no external cause. Social media makes modern panic spread faster than 18th century pamphlets ever could. A false claim can go viral in hours. Algorithms promote engaging content, and fear and outrage are very engaging. We've just upgraded our panic distribution system. We still see dead celebrities and create conspiracy theories about their deaths. We still have urban legends about organ harvesting, poisoned Halloween candy, or dangerous gangs. We still see patterns and randomness and create narratives to explain them. The difference isn't that we're more rational than our ancestors. It's that we have better scientific infrastructure to eventually debunk false beliefs, and we have different cultural frameworks for understanding the world. But give us ambiguous information and high stakes, and we'll create monsters just as quickly as any 18th century villager. The real victims, who actually suffered. Let's take a moment for the people who were actually harmed by the vampire panic, because this wasn't a victimless mass delusion. The dead had their graves violated, their bodies mutilated, and their memories desecrated. Even if they couldn't be harmed by the physical acts, their families were traumatized by watching loved ones being treated as monsters. Families of the accused suffered social stigma. If your relative was declared a vampire, that reflected on you. You might be shunned, lose property, or be suspected of vampirism yourself. The accusation could destroy a family's reputation for generations. People who died of disease were sometimes denied proper burial or had their bodies destroyed. Imagine dying of tuberculosis and then having your corpse burned because people thought you were a vampire. Your final rest and religious rites denied because of fear. The falsely accused living also suffered. Some vampire accusations targeted living people suspected of being vampires or witches. They faced violence, exile, or execution. In some cases, people were killed preemptively to prevent them from becoming vampires after death. Mental health sufferers were probably disproportionately affected. People with conditions causing unusual behavior might have been seen as vampire adjacent. Those who claimed to see the dead could be either witnesses or suspects, depending on how the community interpreted their visions. Marginalized people, the poor, the socially isolated, those with disabilities, foreigners, were more likely to be accused. Vampire accusations, like witch accusations, often targeted people who were already vulnerable. The economic costs fell hardest on the poor. Rich families could afford to move away from vampire-infested areas or pay for protective measures. Poor families had to live with the fear and couldn't escape affected regions. Children growing up during the panic were psychologically affected. Imagine being a kid in a village where adults are digging up corpses and talking constantly about the dead coming to kill you. That's legitimately traumatic. Some people were probably murdered and the deaths blamed on vampires. It's a convenient cover. Kill someone, then claim they were attacked by a vampire. Or kill someone unpopular and posthumously declare them a vampire to justify it. What we learned. Silver linings in madness. Despite the horror, the vampire panic did lead to some positive developments. Medical understanding of death improved dramatically. The need to explain vampire reports led to systematic study of decomposition, disease transmission, and post-mortem changes. This knowledge later saved lives through better forensic medicine and public health. Legal protections for the dead emerged. Laws about handling corpses, confirming death, and regulating burial helped prevent abuses. The principle that dead bodies deserve dignity and that their families have rights became more established. Critical thinking got a workout. The vampire debates forced people to articulate why they believed what they believed and to consider evidence and alternative explanations. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason gained practical application. Documentation practices improved. The need to record vampire investigations led to better record-keeping systems. These administrative practices later proved useful for managing other social issues. Cultural exchange increased. The vampire panic brought attention to Eastern European folklore and culture in Western Europe. This cross-cultural awareness, even though it was filtered through fear and misunderstanding, eventually contributed to greater European cultural integration. The power of mass media became apparent. The spread of vampire beliefs through pamphlets and books demonstrated how information could shape public opinion. This understanding would later inform everything from public health campaigns to political movements. Community bonding occurred, even if over something irrational. Villages came together to fight a perceived threat. The social cohesion created through shared action, even misguided action, had some value for community resilience. The limits of authority were tested. When governments tried to ban vampire hunting, they learned about the challenges of changing popular belief through decree alone. This informed later approaches to managing public opinion and social change. Fiction and art flourished. The vampire panic gave us a rich literary tradition. From Gothic novels to modern paranormal romance, vampire fiction has entertained millions and provided a metaphorical framework for exploring human fears and desires. The folklore lives on, regional variations today. Different regions maintain different versions of vampire folklore, showing how local culture shaped the beliefs. In Romania, vampire folklore persists in rural areas, though often mixed with modern skepticism. The strigoi tradition continues, with some elderly people still believing in protective rituals. Tourism has complicated things, creating a performative version of beliefs for visitors. Greek folklore includes the vrikolakas, which is somewhat different from Slavic vampires. They're more like zombies, and the prevention methods differ. Some Greek islands maintained these traditions well into the 20th century. Russian vampire folklore was always somewhat distinct, with more emphasis on the upir as a sorcerer's curse, rather than a disease-like condition. Soviet-era suppression of folk beliefs pushed these traditions underground but didn't eliminate them. Balkan regions each have their own variations. Bulgarian, Serbian, Croatian folklore all have unique elements. The vampire can be different things: a disease spreader, a moral judge punishing the wicked, or a tragic figure cursed through no fault of their own. Some Asian cultures have vampire-like creatures that developed independently, like the Chinese Jiangxi or the Filipino Aswang. These show that the dead returning to prey on the living is a cross-cultural fear, though the specific forms vary. Modern neo-pagan and occult communities have created new traditions based on historical accounts, though these are more reconstructions or inventions than continuations of unbroken tradition. There's debate about whether this is cultural preservation or cultural appropriation. Academic study of vampire folklore has created a scholarly tradition that documents and analyzes these beliefs. Folklorists, anthropologists, and historians have preserved traditions that might otherwise have been lost as modernization changed rural communities. The final mystery: what were they really seeing? Even with modern knowledge, some vampire reports remain puzzling, not because we think vampires are real, but because we can't always identify exactly what happened. Some exhumation reports describe phenomena that don't match normal decomposition patterns. While most can be explained by soil conditions, temperature, and other factors, a few remain outliers. We can't always know all the variables that affected a specific corpse buried 300 years ago. The psychological component: why some communities experience intense vampire panics while neighboring areas with similar conditions didn't, isn't fully explained. Mass hysteria has psychological triggers, but predicting when and where it will occur is still difficult. Some reported symptoms don't match known diseases perfectly. While tuberculosis explains many cases, some cluster deaths had patterns that don't quite fit any single disease. Multiple diseases occurring simultaneously? Possible, but hard to prove centuries later. The role of possible poisoning or environmental factors hasn't been fully explored. Could contaminated water sources, ergot poisoning, or other environmental toxins have contributed to cluster deaths and hallucinations in some villages? The question of whether any people were actually buried alive and how often this happened is still debated. We know it happened sometimes, but how much of the vampire panic was fueled by real cases of premature burial versus fear of the possibility? The evolution of the vampire myth itself is mysterious. How did similar beliefs develop across different cultures? Were they independent developments based on universal human fears, or did the ideas spread through cultural contact? Both probably played a role, but the relative importance is unclear. Why did the vampire panic peak in the 1720s, 1730s specifically? The Balkans had been through wars and plagues before. What made this particular moment ripe for mass vampire hysteria? Probably a combination of factors, but the specific trigger remains debated. The role of mental illness in both accusers and accused is hard to assess historically. How many reports came from people experiencing psychosis, severe depression, or other mental health crises? How many accused vampires were people with mental health conditions that made them socially marginal? So what happened to the vampires? The simple answer is, they were never there. The vampire panic was a perfect storm of disease, decomposition misunderstandings, cultural beliefs, mass hysteria, and that very human need to find patterns and explanations for random tragedy. But the complicated answer is they transformed. The rotting peasant corpses of Serbian villages became the sophisticated aristocrats of Gothic fiction. The terrifying village demons became romantic antiheroes. The medical mystery became entertainment. Today, vampires are everywhere in our culture, but they're completely disconnected from the panic that created the word. We've taken the fear and turned it into fantasy. The creatures that terrified 18th century Europe now star in teen romance novels and sparkle in sunlight. Is that better? In a way, yes. We no longer dig up corpses and drive stakes through them. We understand disease transmission and decomposition. We've replaced supernatural explanations with scientific ones. But we haven't stopped creating monsters. We've just updated them. Our modern panics have different targets: shadowy conspiracies instead of undead neighbors, internet spread fear instead of pamphlet spread terror. The technology changes, but the psychology remains the same. The vampire panic teaches us something important. Human beings will create explanations for phenomena they don't understand, and those explanations will reflect their deepest fears and cultural anxieties. In the 18th century, death was ever present and poorly understood, so the explanation involved the dead themselves becoming threatening. What are our modern vampires? What fears are we projecting onto the world and creating monsters from? That's the real question the vampire panic leads us with. The good news is that just as the vampire panic eventually ended through education, scientific advancement, and generational change, our modern panics can also be addressed. We can learn to recognize mass hysteria, to question our assumptions, and to seek evidence-based explanations. The bad news is that this requires work, skepticism of our own beliefs, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. It's much easier and emotionally satisfying to believe in a clear enemy, whether that's a vampire, a conspiracy, or whatever monster our culture creates next. The 18th century vampire hunters believed they were protecting their communities. They were wrong, but they were sincere. Today, when we see mass movements based on questionable beliefs, it's worth remembering that the believers aren't stupid or evil. They're afraid, pattern-seeking humans trying to make sense of a threatening world. The real horror of the vampire panic isn't that people believed in vampires. It's that intelligent, educated people had all the tools to figure out the truth: medical knowledge, documentation, empirical observation, and still couldn't overcome fear, social pressure, and the seductive certainty of a simple explanation. We like to think we're smarter than our ancestors. We have better tools, better education, better understanding of the world. But do we have better judgment? When faced with fear and uncertainty, do we respond more rationally than 18th century villagers? History suggests we don't. We just have different vampires. So the next time you hear about a mass panic, a conspiracy theory spreading online, or a group of people convinced that an unlikely threat is real, remember the vampire hunters of Serbia. Remember the doctors who wrote official reports about undead creatures. Remember the governments that banned vampire hunting. And ask yourself, what are we digging up and burning today that future generations will find incomprehensible? The vampires are gone. The panic ended. The corpses rest undisturbed in their graves, decomposing as nature intended. But the lessons remain, waiting for us to learn them before we create the next wave of monsters. Because as long as people die in ways we don't understand, as long as fear spreads through communities, as long as we seek patterns in chaos and create enemies from uncertainty, there will always be vampires. They just won't be the ones we expect. Thanks for watching. Don't have nightmares. Or do, at least now you know they're not caused by dead neighbors climbing out of their graves. Probably.